99, Nora. That's all you're worth. I saw all 99.
She was sitting on the bathroom floor at 2 in the morning when she started counting again. Not the number, she already knew. That one was fixed, permanent, carved somewhere behind her eyes, where she could not reach it even if she wanted to. 99. She knew that number, the way she knew her own name, the way she knew the sound of his key turning in the front door lock, the way she knew which floorboard in the hallway creaked and how to step around it without making a sound. What she was counting now was different. 19 days until her due date, maybe less. The baby had shifted sometime last Tuesday, like she was already trying to find a way out. Nora pressed her back against the cold porcelain of the bathtub and put both hands flat on her stomach and tried to do the math the way she always did when the apartment got too quiet. 19 days, maybe fewer, and she had been telling herself for 4 months that she would have a plan by then. She did not have a plan yet. What she had was a small black hard drive in the bottom drawer of the dresser in the bedroom, tucked behind a stack of sweaters she had not worn since before she was pregnant. She had found it by accident 4 months ago, reaching for an extra blanket one night while Callum was in Boston for a board meeting. She had picked it up, turned it over in her hands, put it back exactly where she found it. She had not touched it since. She knew what was on it. She did not need to watch it to know. What she did not know was whether knowing was enough, or whether she was still waiting for herself to become the kind of person who could do something with what she knew. The bathroom tiles were white with small gray veins running through them. Margaret had chosen them. Margaret had chosen everything in this apartment, from the tile pattern to the particular shade of cream on the living room walls, which she called bone, with a precision that Nora had once found amusing and now found clarifying. This was what wealth looked like when it wanted to own you. Not through cruelty, but through total aesthetic occupation. Every surface was Margaret's. Every choice had been made before Nora arrived. The apartment did not have room for her because it had never been designed to accommodate her. It had been designed to display her. She shifted on the cold floor and felt the baby move. A slow roll, not a kick, more like a turning over in sleep. 19 days. 3 weeks earlier, on a Thursday night when rain hit the window like static on a dead channel, Callum had come home in one of his quiet moods. The quiet ones were worse than the loud ones. With the loud ones, there was at least some telegraph. You could see it coming from the way he walked through the door, the set of his jaw, the particular energy that filled the room before he even said a word. With the quiet ones, there was nothing. He would be perfectly normal through dinner. He would ask about her day. He would refill her water glass without being asked. And then something would shift, some internal calculation she had never been able to map or predict, and by the time she understood what was happening, it was already too late to do anything useful about it. That night he had come home with the belt already off. She had not cried. She had learned, somewhere around the 6th or 7th month of their marriage, that crying made it last longer. So she had taught herself a different kind of endurance, the kind that lived entirely in her head, in a small, clean room she had built there for exactly this purpose, where the walls were white and there was no sound, and she could go somewhere else while her body stayed behind and absorbed whatever needed to be absorbed. She counted. It was the only thing she could do with her mind while her body was elsewhere. She counted tiles on the wall. She counted the seconds between his breaths. She counted the number of times the belt made contact, because it gave the chaos a structure, a beginning and an end, something finite she could measure. He stopped at 99. He said, when it was over, with the particular calm he always had afterward. A good husband does not go to 100. She had been lying face down on the bed, still. The baby had not moved either, and she had spent the next 6 hours pressing her hand to her stomach, waiting for any sign of life, any small flutter, before the baby finally shifted at around 4 in the morning, and Nora had breathed for what felt like the first time since dinner. She had not gone to the hospital. She had not called anyone. She had gotten up at 6:30 before Callum was awake, run a warm bath, taken stock of what the night had left behind on her body, then gotten dressed in a way that covered everything and gone to the kitchen and started making coffee. He came down at 7:15 in a charcoal suit and a blue tie she had given him for his birthday. He kissed her on the cheek. He said he had a board meeting at 10. He picked up his orange juice, drank half of it, standing at the counter, put the glass back down without looking at her, and left. The apartment was quiet. She stood at the kitchen counter for a long time after she heard the elevator close. She stood there until the coffee finished brewing, and then she poured a cup she did not drink. She looked out the window at the city below, doing its ordinary morning things. Taxis and delivery trucks and people walking fast with their collars turned up against the cold. And she thought, I am 8 months pregnant, and there is a hard drive in the bottom drawer of the dresser, and I do not have a plan. She needed a plan. She had thought about leaving before, many times, but Callum had been clear early on. In the indirect way, he was always clear about things that mattered to him. He had mentioned a case he had read about, a custody dispute, a colleague from law school where the mother had tried to leave, and the father had used the attempted departure as grounds to establish instability, unfit parenting. He had mentioned it the way you mention weather. He had not looked at her when he said it. He did not need to. The message had landed exactly where he intended it to land, and it had stayed there ever since. She was afraid that if she tried to leave, she would lose the baby. She was afraid that if she stayed, she would lose herself. She could not figure out which fear was larger, or which one she should let win. She had been sitting with that problem for months. Her phone buzzed on the edge of the sink. She picked it up. Dad, the screen said. She sat looking at the name for a moment. Walter Reeves called every few weeks, usually from a different number. He changed them the way some people changed shoes, picking up prepaid phones during long stretches of driving or after returning from somewhere he did not talk about in detail. He was 58 years old, a retired gunnery sergeant with 3 deployments behind him and a particular relationship with silence that Nora had grown up both understanding and being frustrated by. He was not a man who said things. He was a man who showed up and did things. And the gap between those two modes of being had cost him his first marriage and put significant strain on his relationship with Nora over the years, in ways neither of them had ever quite managed to put into words. He called. She answered. Hey, baby girl. His voice was the same as always, low, even, the kind of voice that had learned to carry weight without sounding weighted. Hey, Dad, you sleeping? Almost, she said, which was not exactly a lie. How is the baby active? Keeps me up at night. That is good, he said. That means she is strong. A pause. How are you doing? You sound tired. I am fine, she said. Her voice came out exactly right. She had been practicing this for so long that it was no longer an effort. The slight warmth in the tone, the relaxed cadence, the absence of anything that would cause him to ask a follow-up question she was not prepared to answer. Just a lot going on. Getting close. I know, he said. I am thinking about coming up around the due date. Her chest did something she did not have a name for. You do not have to do that. I want to, he said simply. She is my first grandchild. I will let you know when things start moving. I will call you. They talked for another few minutes about nothing in particular. The weather in Wilmington. A neighbor with a new dog, whether the baby's room was ready, normal things. Nora sat on the bathroom floor and answered each question with the precision of someone disabling a security system, one panel at a time. She did not waver. She did not let anything slip. When they hung up, she sat in the bathroom a little longer. Her hand was shaking. Not dramatically, just the small constant tremor of sustained effort, like a muscle held too long in one position. She looked at her hand until it stopped. Then she got up and went back to bed. Callum was asleep on his side, his breathing deep and even, his face perfectly relaxed. In sleep, he looked like a different person entirely. In sleep, there was nothing threatening about him at all. She lay down on her side and looked at the dresser across the room. She could not see the bottom drawer from where she was lying. She knew exactly what was in it. 19 days. She closed her eyes and did not sleep for a very long time. Walter Reeves was not a sentimental man, but he kept one photograph on his kitchen table. Not framed, just propped against the fruit bowl that he had been looking at for 12 years. It was a picture of Nora at 16, standing in the driveway of her grandmother's house in Georgia, with her arms crossed and her chin tilted up at the camera the way teenagers tilt their chins at things they are not sure about. She was not exactly smiling, but there was something in the corner of her mouth that suggested she was thinking about it. He had taken that picture on the last weekend he was home before his final deployment. He had not known it would be his final deployment when he left, but he had known, with the particular instinct of men who have spent enough time in places where being wrong about danger has permanent consequences, that something was different about this one. He had stood in his mother-in-law's driveway and taken a photograph of his teenage daughter, who was already, at 16, more self-sufficient than most adults he had ever commanded, and he had thought, I am going to miss more of her life than I should have. And then he had gone anyway, because that was the job, and the job was the only thing he had ever been unambiguously good at. He was in the kitchen on a Wednesday morning when the letter arrived. A plain white envelope with his Wilmington address, written in handwriting he did not recognize. No return address, mailed from a zip code in Manhattan. He opened it at the kitchen table. Inside there was a USB drive and nothing else. No note, no explanation, nothing. He turned the drive over in his hand, looked at the zip code. He got up, got his laptop from the counter, sat back down, and plugged the drive in. There were video files, dated, organized with the kind of obsessive precision that belongs to people who think they will never be caught. He opened the first file. He watched for 11 minutes before he closed the laptop. He sat at his kitchen table for a long time after that. The coffee was getting cold. Outside, the neighbor's dog was barking at something in the yard. Normal morning sounds, the specific mundane texture of an ordinary Wednesday in a neighborhood where nothing much happened. And he sat inside, all of it, perfectly still, the way he had learned to be still, in places where stillness kept you alive. People who have never been in combat sometimes think soldiers get angry first. They do not. At least the good ones do not. What comes first, in the moments that actually count, is absolute clarity, the kind that clears everything else off the table, the way you clear a workspace before doing something precise. Anger is a fuel. Clarity is the engine. You need the engine before you need the fuel. He opened the laptop again. He watched the rest of it. When he was done, he closed the laptop and picked up his phone. He did not call Nora. He did not call Callum Hayes. He called Marcus Webb, who had served with him in Fallujah and now ran a small criminal defense practice in Lower Manhattan. "It is Walter," he said when Marcus picked up. "I know. I have caller ID. You are one of about 6 people I still pick up for." "I need a criminal attorney," Walter said. "A good one. Not you. I need someone who does prosecution side work, Someone who knows the DA's office in Manhattan. A pause. That is a specific ask. I have a specific situation. Another pause. Give me an hour, Marcus said. I will make some calls. Thank you, Walter said. He hung up and sat for another moment. Then he opened the laptop again. Not to watch the files. He did not need to watch them again. He opened it to make a list. He was a list man by nature and by training. You made a list of what you had, what you needed, what the obstacles were, and what needed to happen in what order. You did not act until the list made sense. Acting before the list made sense was how people made irreversible mistakes. What he had, evidence. What he needed, legal infrastructure to make that evidence useful. What the obstacles were, the Hayes family's money, their lawyers, and the NDA they had almost certainly made Callum's previous wife sign. What needed to happen, he needed to know about the first wife before he could know what he was working with. He had spoken to Marcus's contact by then, a woman named Jennifer Okafor, who had spent 9 years in the Manhattan DA's office before going into private practice and still had relationships in that building that got phone calls returned. Walter told her what he had. She asked several questions that indicated she understood exactly what kind of case this was. She said she would need to know about any previous victims. She used the word victims without inflection, the way professionals do. Walter said he understood. He would find out. He drove to the hardware store that afternoon and bought a padlock for the file cabinet in his home office. He locked the laptop inside it. He put the key on his keychain. The mistake had been staying away. The mistake had been assuming that distance meant safety, that Nora's silences on the phone were her being private rather than her being careful. He had been reading her the wrong way because it was easier to believe she was fine than to push on a door. He was not sure he had the right to push. He was done not pushing. He picked up his phone and called his daughter. It was a Thursday evening, just past 7. She answered on the third ring. "Hey, Dad, just checking in," he said. 12 days, right? Give or take. I booked a ticket, he said. I will be there around your due date. I figured I would stay close in case things start moving early. A pause. Something in the quality of her breath shifted very slightly, the way breath shifts when a person is trying to keep something out of their voice. He knew that breath. He had heard it before in people who were holding more than they were showing. He had just never heard it from her and known it for what it was. "You do not have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "I want to." They talked a while longer. She sounded fine. She always sounded fine. He thought about the hard drive in his padlocked file cabinet. He thought about what he had watched on that ordinary Wednesday morning and what it had done to the ordinary quality of that morning and what it would do to the next few months of everyone involved. He had not yet told her about the USB drive. He would not tell her yet. What she needed right now was not to know that he knew. What she needed was to know that he was coming. "I will seek you soon," he said. "Okay, Dad," she said. "Safe travels." He sat at his kitchen table after they hung up and looked at the photograph propped against the fruit bowl. 16-year-old Nora, with her arms crossed and her chin tilted up, standing in a driveway on the last weekend before his last deployment, looking at something past the camera with an expression that was not quite a smile. He had left anyway that morning, got in the car, drove to the base, did that job. He was not going to leave this time. In New York that same week, Nora burned dinner, not dramatically. She just overcooked the salmon by about 4 minutes because she had been standing at the kitchen counter trying to remember whether she had locked the screen on the laptop after the last time she looked at the files on the hard drive, and in the process of trying to remember that she lost track of the fish. She caught it before it was inedible, plated it with the vegetables and the rice, and set everything on the table with 4 minutes to spare before Callum came through the door. She heard the way he set his keys down on the entryway table. That was all it took. The particular sound of that specific motion, the slight extra weight in it that had nothing to do with the keys and everything to do with whatever he had been carrying since mid-afternoon. She had calibrated herself to that sound over 2 years, the way you calibrate to a barometer. She could read the pressure shifts in this apartment with her body before she could read them with her mind. She put the food on the table. She poured his water. She made sure everything was where he would expect it to be. Dinner was quiet. He ate without looking up from his phone, scrolling through something she could not see. She ate carefully, methodically, not rushing, not lingering. The salmon was slightly overcooked, and she waited for him to notice, and he did not. Or, if he noticed, he did not say anything, and she could not decide which of those was better. It happened later, around 9 o'clock, not with warning, not with a buildup she could have navigated, but with the sudden flip of a switch that she still, after 2 years, had not found a way to predict. The reason was the phone. She had answered a call from her doctor's office confirming an appointment, and she had been maybe 30 seconds late, noticing that Callum was trying to get her attention. 30 seconds, maybe less. What came after had no belt. But there were other ways to hurt someone, and Callum Hayes was a meticulous man who understood the principle of variety. Afterward, she lay still and listened to him in the shower, and looked at the ceiling and put her hand on her stomach and felt the baby shift in the familiar reassuring way that meant she was there and okay, and still turning in the dark, completely unaware. Callum came out of the shower in a good mood. He often did afterward. He sat on the edge of the bed and said something about a golf weekend in March that some colleague was organizing in Florida. Asked her if she would be okay managing things at home if he was gone for 3 days. She said, yes, of course. He kissed her on the top of the head, turned the light out. In the dark, she thought about the baby, about the texture of the apartment she had grown up in before her father's first deployment, the way the kitchen smelled like coffee even when no one was making coffee, the particular afternoon light through the living room window, the creaky third step on the stairs. She thought about what a child absorbs from a home, not the big events, not the dramatic moments, but the small accumulated atmosphere of the place they grow up in. Her daughter was not going to grow up in this apartment. She did not have a complete plan yet, but she had a beginning. In 3 days, she was going to call the number Evelyn downstairs had mentioned to her 6 weeks ago, the name of the woman who had lived in this apartment 3 years before. Diane Rousseau. She had not called yet. She was starting to think readiness was something she had been waiting for that was not going to arrive on its own. You had to move toward it. The next morning, Nora's phone rang at 8:15 while she was making tea. The name on the screen was Margaret. She let it ring twice before she answered. 2 rings was the right amount, long enough not to seem eager, short enough not to seem avoidant. She had learned this calibration from Callum, who had learned it from Margaret, which told her something about how this family communicated with the people they were managing. Good morning, Margaret said. Her voice had a particular quality that Nora had spent a long time trying to define. Warm but bounded, the warmth of someone who understood warmth as a tactic. How are you feeling, darling? You must be getting so close. 12 days, Nora said. Give or take. You must be exhausted. A pause designed to convey sympathy. I actually wanted to talk to you about your prenatal care. I have spoken to a doctor named Dr. Harrington. He is absolutely extraordinary. He delivered Callum's cousin's twins last spring, and he is very much looking forward to being involved. He is so meticulous about documentation, making sure everything is on the record correctly. You know how these things go. In any medical situation, having the right paperwork is just essential. for everyone's protection. Nora stood at the kitchen counter and looked out the window. The city below was doing its ordinary morning things. She understood exactly what she had just been told. Dr. Harrington would document whatever Margaret and Callum needed documented. If Nora arrived at a hospital with injuries or with a story that did not match Callum's preferred narrative, Dr. Harrington would be in a position to provide a counter-narrative on paper with his credentials behind it, having the right paperwork for everyone's protection. "I will think about it," Nora said. Her voice was perfectly even. "Wonderful," Margaret said. After she hung up, Nora put the phone face down on the counter and stood there a moment. She was thinking about Dr. Harrington and paperwork. She was thinking that she needed to move faster than she had been moving. She picked up the phone and texted Evelyn downstairs. "Not about Diane, not yet. Just a check-in. Did she need anything from the market?" Nora was planning to go out this afternoon. Evelyn texted back a grocery list with a heart emoji. Nora put her coat on. She moved carefully through the lobby, nodded to the doorman, walked 2 blocks before she turned south. The cold air felt like something clarifying, something that pulled the edges of things into sharper focus. She was 31 years old and 8 months pregnant, and she had a Marine father in Wilmington who did not know the full shape of what his daughter's life had become, and she had a hard drive in a bottom drawer that she had been afraid to touch for 4 months, and she had 12 days, maybe less. She walked to the park. She sat on a bench in the cold and watched the bare trees and did the math one more time, not the math of days, the math of what she had versus what she needed, and the gap between those two things, and what it would take to close it. She thought about Callum saying, "A good husband does not go to 100. She thought about her daughter. She got up off the bench and walked home. That afternoon, she knocked on Evelyn Marsh's door on the floor below. Evelyn was 73 years old, 5'2", and had lived in this building since before Callum was born. She opened the door in a bright orange cardigan, reading glasses on top of her head, and looked at Nora the way she had been looking at Nora for the past 8 months. Not with pity, with recognition. "Come in," Evelyn said. "I will put on tea." Nora sat at the small kitchen table, while Evelyn moved around the kitchen with the efficiency of a woman who has been doing things in her own kitchen for decades and does not require assistance or commentary. She set out 2 cups and a plate of butter cookies and sat down across from Nora. "I need Diane's number," Nora said. "Not tomorrow, today." Evelyn looked at her for a moment. Then she got up, went to the small desk in the corner of the living room, opened the top drawer, and came back with a folded piece of paper. "She gave it to me 6 months before she left," Evelyn said. "She said I might need it someday. I told her I hoped I would not." She sat back down and wrapped both hands around her teacup. "I am glad you are ready." Nora looked at the paper. She folded it and put it in her coat pocket. "How did she do it?" Nora asked. "When she left, how did she actually do it?" Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "She did not have much," she said. She had saved money for almost a year, small amounts, cash from the grocery budget. She had a bag ready for 3 months before she used it, and she had a friend. The friend was the important part. She said the hardest thing was not the leaving. The hardest thing was believing she deserved to be helped. Nora looked at the butter cookies on the plate between them. "You have people," Evelyn said. "Your father is coming. I am here. Diane will talk to you if you call. That woman Jennifer, the attorney, she is the best there is at what she does." She paused. "You are not doing this alone, even though I know it has felt that way for a very long time." Nora looked up at her. "I saw it," Evelyn said simply. "I have lived in buildings long enough to know what certain silences mean. I did not want to push before you were ready." She looked at Nora steadily. "Are you ready?" Nora thought about the hard drive in the bottom drawer of the dresser. She thought about 19 days, now 12 days, now closing further every night. She thought about a baby who was already trying to find her way out, who deserved a home that did not require her mother to go somewhere else in her own head just to survive inside it. Yes, Nora said. Evelyn reached across the table and put her hand over Nora's. She held it there for a moment. Just that, no words needed. The simple weight of one person choosing to be present for another, in the way that actually costs something. Then she let go. Good, she said. Drink your tea, and then go call Diane. The offices of Hayes Industries occupied the top 4 floors of a glass tower on 6th Avenue that had been designed to communicate a specific message about the people who worked inside it. The message was not subtle. It was the message of a building that had cost a very specific amount of money to build and wanted you to know that amount without being told directly. The particular silence that money buys in spaces where ordinary city noise would otherwise intrude. Callum Hayes arrived at 8 o'clock every weekday morning through a private elevator that opened directly into the executive suite on the 43rd floor, bypassing the lobby entirely. Callum did not like lobbies. He did not like the managed democracy of shared spaces, the way a lobby required you to exist on equal terms with people whose terms were not equal to yours. The private elevator was, among other things, a philosophical statement. On a Tuesday morning in late January, he stepped out of the private elevator at 8:03 and found a man sitting in the chair across from his desk. The man sitting in it was not in the posture the chair was designed to produce. He was sitting the way men sit when chairs are irrelevant to them, upright without stiffness, still without tension, occupying the space with a completeness that had nothing to do with the chair and everything to do with the person. He was wearing dark slacks and a gray button-down, and he looked, at first glance, like someone's uncle. At second glance, he looked like something else entirely. Callum stopped walking. His assistant's desk outside the glass partition was empty. The man in the chair had not stood up when Callum entered, which was notable, and he was looking at Callum with an expression that was not hostile and not deferential and not anything that fit neatly into the categories Callum used to read rooms. "Mr. Reeves," Callum said. His voice was even. He had a good voice for evenness, one of his more reliable tools. "I do not believe we had a meeting." "We did not," Walter said. Callum crossed to his desk and set his bag down. He did not sit yet. Standing was the right move. It gave him the room, the desk, the elevation. He recalibrated in the way he always recalibrated when a situation was not following the script he had prepared. Walter Reeves was 58 years old, retired military, lived alone in Wilmington. He was Nora's father, which made him a peripheral figure in Callum's mental map of his marriage. Someone who called occasionally from rotating phone numbers and had attended the wedding with the contained politeness of a man doing his best with a situation he had not been consulted about. He had shaken Callum's hand in the hospital room 3 weeks ago and been perfectly manageable. "What can I do for you?" Callum said. Still even, still in control of the room, Walter said, "I watched the footage." The words were placed into the room the way you place a tool on a workbench, not thrown, not emphasized, just set down with the precision of someone who knows what a tool is for and has already decided how to use it. The room did something, not visibly. Nothing in Callum's face moved in any way that a camera would have captured, but something shifted in his chest, a rapid internal reorganization, the way a system reroutes when one pathway closes. He had been careful with the hard drive. He had been careful in the way a man is careful when he is certain he is the only person who knows where something is. He sat down. "I am not sure what you think you saw," Callum said. Walter looked at him without expression. "I know what I saw." Callum opened his desk drawer and removed his phone. He did this openly, making the gesture itself a statement. I am calling my lawyers. He placed the phone on the desk face up and typed a text with one hand while maintaining eye contact. Let me be clear about something, Callum said. Whatever you believe you have, it was obtained illegally. Any footage from a private residence, accessed without consent, is inadmissible, and the acquisition of it constitutes criminal trespass of personal property. My legal team will explain that to you in detail if you would like. Walter was quiet for a moment. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it carefully and placed it on the desk between them. Callum looked at it. He picked it up. It was a document on official letterhead, and it took him approximately 4 seconds to understand what he was reading. Not a civil filing, not a restraining order, not a family court petition. The letterhead was from the Office of the District Attorney, New York County. The filing was criminal. The timestamp read 7:47 a.m. He read it again. He set it back down. Diane Rousseau has agreed to testify, Walter said. His voice had the same quality it had had since Callum walked in. Not raised, not cold, not performing anything, just present. Her NDA with your family is unenforceable in the context of a criminal proceeding with new material evidence. The agreement she signed has a clause that voids it under exactly these circumstances, which I suspect you were not made aware of when the NDA was drafted, or if you were, you believed the circumstances that would trigger it would never arise. Callum looked at the paper again. His phone buzzed on the desk. His attorney, returning the text. He did not look at the phone. The footage and the filing belong to my daughter, Walter continued. She prepared this before I knew the footage existed. I am here because she asked me to deliver it. He paused. She did not ask me to say anything else, but I am going to say one thing on my own behalf, and then I will go. Callum looked up. I have spent 30 years being somewhere other than where my daughter needed me, Walter said. I am done with that. Whatever happens in that courtroom, I will be there. And whatever you were counting on, that she was alone, that she did not have anyone in her corner who understood how to do what needed to be done, you counted wrong. He stood up. He did not extend his hand. He buttoned his jacket. He walked to the door of the office, and then he stopped, without turning around, and said one more thing. She named the baby June. He left. Callum sat at his desk for a long time after the sound of the elevator faded. He thought about Nora. He thought about the hard drive, which he had put in the bottom drawer of the dresser because it was his apartment and his dresser. And it had not occurred to him that the bottom drawer was not a location of perfect security. It had not occurred to him because it had not needed to occur to him. Nora had never given him reason to believe she went through his things. He was recalculating the entire architecture of the past 2 years, not what had happened in it, but what Nora had known, and when, and what she had done with what she knew. He was trying to find the moment when she had stopped being the person he thought she was and started being someone else, and he could not find it. The inability to find it was, in some ways, more disturbing than the document on his desk. He had always believed he was the one in that marriage who was watching, who was paying attention, who understood the shape of the situation while the other person simply lived inside it. He had been wrong about that. He picked up his phone. He called his attorney. The attorney explained the filing, the evidentiary situation, the NDA, and the clause, and the conditions under which it became unenforceable. What about Diane? Callum said. Will she actually testify? A pause on the line. The pause was long enough to be its own kind of answer. Based on what I am seeing, his attorney said carefully, she has already given a preliminary statement to the DA's office. The statement is substantial, Callum. It is corroborative in ways that are going to be difficult to. Yes or no, Callum said. Will she testify? Another pause, shorter this time. Yes, he ended the call. He placed the phone face down on the desk. He looked at the window, which offered a view of the city that on any other morning would have communicated the specific comfort of elevation, of being above the ordinary run of things, insulated by altitude and money, and the particular grace of having been born into the right family at the right time. This morning the view was just glass and air. He called his mother. Margaret was not answering because Margaret was managing something of her own. He thought about something Walter had said, which he had not fully processed at the time because he had been processing too many other things simultaneously. She prepared this before I knew the footage existed. He had been trying for 3 weeks to locate the moment when Nora had changed. The specific point in time when the woman he had believed he understood had become someone he apparently had not understood at all. He still could not find it. And the inability to find it meant something he was only now beginning to fully reckon with. That the change might not have been a change, that the person Nora actually was had been present the entire time, visible to anyone who was actually looking rather than only observing what they expected to see, that he had spent 2 years living with someone he had consistently underestimated, not because she had hidden herself from him, but because he had never genuinely tried to see her. He had been so certain he was the one with the full picture. The phone on his desk rang. He did not answer it. She had left at 6. Nora had packed the night before, not dramatically, 2 bags. The baby's essentials in one, her own in the other, the laptop from the toy box, the external drive in the inside pocket of her coat, the same pocket where Diane's phone number had lived until she no longer needed to carry it. She had moved through the pre-dawn apartment with the contained efficiency of someone who has rehearsed this in her head enough times that the actual doing of it felt almost familiar. She had not left a note. A note was a communication, and a communication implied a relationship she was not interested in maintaining any further than the courts required. The baby had woken at 5:30, her usual time, and Nora had fed her in the dark with the particular focused quiet of those pre-dawn feeds. The baby ate with her eyes half open, working steadily, one small hand pressed flat against Nora's collarbone as if checking for a heartbeat. At 6:05, they were in the elevator. At 6:15, they were in a cab heading to Brooklyn. Evelyn Marsh had a granddaughter who ran a small consulting business incorporated in Delaware, and that granddaughter had a credit card in the business name that she had offered, without being asked many questions, to use for a hotel reservation if it ever came to that. Evelyn had presented this option 2 weeks ago with the matter-of-factness of a woman who had lived long enough in New York City apartment buildings to have seen situations that called for creative logistics, and who had made her peace with being useful in the ways available to her. The hotel was in Brooklyn near the park. Not fancy, clean, quiet. The kind of place with a front desk person who asked no questions because they had seen enough to know that questions were not always what people needed. Nora checked in at 7. She put the baby down on the center of the bed and sat in the chair by the window and looked out at a street that was beginning to come alive. A coffee shop opening its gates, 2 men unloading a delivery truck, a woman in scrubs walking quickly with her head down. She watched all of it and felt something she had not felt inside 4 walls in a very long time, the simple animal comfort of being in a space that did not belong to anyone who could hurt her. The baby slept. Nora sat. Walter called her at noon. "He is calling his lawyers," Walter said. No preamble. He was a man who did not use preamble when facts were available. "Jennifer says the preliminary statement from Diane is solid. They are moving quickly on the DA side because of the footage. Are you somewhere safe?" "Yes." "Is the baby okay?" "She is sleeping," Nora said. "She is fine, Dad." A pause. "I am coming over," Walter said. I will get the address from Evelyn. You do not have to, Nora. She stopped. She looked at the window. Outside, the coffee shop had a small line now. People with their Tuesday morning routines intact, coffee and phones, and the forward momentum of ordinary life. Okay, she said. Come over. He arrived at 1:30 with sandwiches from a deli 2 blocks away. He knocked twice, and she let him in, and he set the cups on the table, and they sat down across from each other, and for a little while, neither of them said anything, which was comfortable. In the way, silence is comfortable between people who grew up in the same house and learned the same relationship to quiet. The baby woke while they were eating. Nora got up and lifted her from the bed and brought her back to the table, and Walter watched his daughter hold his granddaughter with the specific attentiveness of a man cataloging something he intended to remember. She looks like you did, he said, at that age. Does she? The nose, he said, and the way she holds her mouth. Nora looked down at the baby. June looked back up at her with the wide, unfocused gaze of the very new, taking in light and shape without yet having the equipment to make sense of either. Dad, Nora said, the envelope I sent, the one without a return address. Walter was quiet for a moment. I got it. I needed you to have it, but I could not ask you directly, because if I asked you directly, that was me asking you to do something, and I needed you to decide on your own. Does that make sense? It makes sense, he said. I did not know what you would do with it, she said. I hoped, but I did not know. I know what to do with things that need to be done, Walter said. Simple, not defensive, just true. She looked at him across the table. He looked back at her. He was a man who had spent the majority of her childhood somewhere else, who had been present in her life in the inconsistent way of people whose work required a particular kind of total commitment that left room for nothing of equal weight alongside it. She had spent a significant portion of her 20s being quietly angry about that. The anger had been there, shaping the slight formality between them that had never quite dissolved even when they were at their closest. She was not angry right now. He is going to fight it, she said. The family has money and they will use all of it. Let them, Walter said. Jennifer knows what she is doing. The footage is yours. You are the one who found it and copied it and got it out. Everything else is just process. It could take a long time. I know. I am going to need help, practical help. I have some money I set aside in cash over the past few months. Not much, but enough to start. I need a lawyer of my own. I know what you need, Walter said. We will work through it. He looked at her steadily. You are not alone in this. That part is done. She looked at him. She thought about all the phone calls from rotating numbers, the voice always the same, low and even, the way he had shaken Callum's hand in the hospital room with an expression she had read in the moment as measured tolerance and had only later understood was something else entirely. When did you know? She asked. That something was wrong. When did you actually know? He was quiet for a moment. He set down his sandwich. The night of your first call after you got married, he said. You called to tell me you were happy, and the call was 3 minutes long, and you have never been the kind of person who calls to tell me you are happy. You call to tell me things. When you are happy, you do not call, you just are. He paused. I did not know what was wrong, but I knew something was. Why did you not say anything? He looked at her. The question sat between them with the weight of everything it was actually asking. Because you did not ask me to, he said, and I told myself that was respect, giving you room to handle things your way. He was quiet for a moment. It was not respect. It was easier than being wrong about something I could not fix from where I was sitting. The room was quiet. The baby had fallen back to sleep in Nora's arms. Outside, the ordinary Tuesday afternoon was doing its ordinary things. You are here now, she said. I am here now, he agreed. It was not an absolution. Neither of them was reaching for that. It was something smaller and more durable than absolution. The plain fact of presence. A person doing the work of showing up even when showing up was late. It was enough, not because it erased anything, because it was real. Margaret Hayes found the hotel at 7 in the evening. Nora had expected this. Margaret had money, and money had access to people who could locate a credit card charge in a Brooklyn hotel inside of a business day if the motivation was sufficient. The motivation was sufficient. She heard the knock, and she knew before she opened the door. Margaret was in a charcoal coat, her hair done, her face composed in the particular expression she wore when she was managing a situation she had not anticipated but was refusing to be destabilized by. She was 64 years old, and she had been managing situations for long enough that the management had become indistinguishable from her personality. She looked at Nora in the doorway and said, "May I come in?" In the tone of someone who considers the answer a formality. Nora opened the door. Margaret came in and looked at the room, the 2 bags, the hotel table, the bassinet where June was sleeping. She looked at all of it, and then she sat in the chair by the window and folded her hands in her lap and looked at Nora. "I want to resolve this," she said. "I think we both understand that this has become complicated in ways that do not serve anyone. I would like to find a path that protects everyone involved, including that baby." "Including the baby," Nora said. "Yes." A pause. "I have a figure in mind. 12 million, structured over 4 years. In exchange for a withdrawal of the criminal complaint and a custody arrangement that reflects." "Who did you pay to find Diane?" Nora said. Margaret stopped. The first time, Nora said, "Not the NDA. That came later, before the NDA. Who did you pay, and how much did it take?" The room was quiet. Margaret looked at her with the expression of someone recalibrating, deciding how much of what she knows to acknowledge. "Callum," Margaret said, "has certain patterns. I have known this for a long time. I have managed it for a long time. That is not the same as condoning it, is it not?" Nora said. Margaret looked at her, not with hostility, with something more complicated. The look of a woman who has made a series of choices over a long period of time that she has justified to herself in a language she has become fluent in, and who is sitting now in a hotel room in Brooklyn watching that language fail to translate. "The 12 million, Margaret said again. "No," Nora said. "Nora, there is no number," Nora said. "There is no conversation we can have about numbers. That is not what this is." She looked at Margaret directly, without the careful management she had always employed in this woman's presence, the slight softening she had used to make herself less threatening, more palatable, easier to dismiss. She was done with that. "I want you to know something. My daughter is going to know what happened, not the Hayes family version, the real version. She will know it when she is old enough to know it, and I will tell her honestly. And when she is old enough to decide whether she wants a relationship with her grandmother, that will be her choice to make, not mine, not yours." Margaret was very still. "That is all I want you to know," Nora said. "You can go." Margaret sat for another moment. Then she stood. She buttoned her coat. She looked at the bassinet, where June was sleeping with her arms out, breathing in the deep, uncomplicated way of someone with nothing on her conscience, because she had not yet lived long enough to have anything on it. Something crossed Margaret's face that Nora did not try to interpret. "I was 26 when Callum was born," Margaret said. This was not something she had prepared to say. Nora could tell by the lack of construction in it, the absence of the careful framing she applied to everything she said intentionally. "I was 26 and his father was not a kind man, and I made choices about how to manage that which I have spent a very long time not examining too closely." She stopped. "That is not an excuse. I want to be clear that I am not offering it as one." Nora looked at her. "I know what I enabled," Margaret said. "I have always known. I found language for it that let me continue knowing it and still get up every morning, but I have always known. She looked at Nora directly. That does not make it different. It just means I do not have the defense of ignorance, which is the only defense that would actually matter. The room was very quiet. I know, Nora said simply. Then she left. Nora stood in the middle of the room for a moment after the door closed. Then she walked to the bassinet and stood over her daughter and watched her breathe. She picked up her phone and texted Walter. She came. She is gone. We are okay. 3 dots appeared almost immediately. Then, good, get some sleep. Tomorrow we work. She put the phone down. She turned the lights off. She sat in the chair by the window in the dark and listened to the sounds of a Brooklyn evening. Traffic, someone's music from down the street, a door closing somewhere in the building, the particular alive hum of a city going about its business in the night. No footsteps, just the city, just her daughter breathing, just that. The courtroom on the 4th floor of the Manhattan Criminal Courts building on Center Street was not the kind of room that accommodated the performance of power. It had been built for function rather than impression. Wood panels that had absorbed decades of difficult testimony, fluorescent lighting that flattened everything it touched, rows of fixed benches that filled with the specific population of people who came to these rooms by necessity rather than choice. The room did not care who you were outside of it. It applied the same flat light to everyone. Callum Hayes had spent his professional life in rooms that bent toward him. Board rooms, conference rooms, the kind of hotel suites where the furniture arranged itself around whoever had booked the largest block of rooms. He understood rooms that bent. This one did not bend. He sat at the defense table in a suit that had cost more than most people in the room made in a month, and the suit meant nothing to the fluorescent light. Diane Rousseau was 41 years old. She was wearing a dark blue blazer and gray slacks, and she had her hair pulled back in a way that suggested she had thought carefully about how she wanted to look today and had arrived at simple. She did not look at Callum when she came in. She looked at the room. A quick, complete survey, the kind of look that belongs to someone who has prepared themselves for the specific experience of being in this space and is confirming that it matches the preparation. Then she sat down. The assistant district attorney was a woman in her late 30s named Carla Mendez, who had been with the office for 11 years and who had the particular quality of unhurried precision that belongs to people who have done this long enough to understand that juries and judges respond to clarity over theater. She was not performing anything. She was building something, brick by deliberate brick, and she had all morning to do it. The early questions established the foundation. How long had Diane lived in the apartment on the Upper West Side? What was the nature of her relationship with Callum Hayes? When had the relationship begun, and when had it ended, and under what circumstances? Diane answered each question clearly, without embellishment, with the directness of someone who has decided that the plain shape of the truth is sufficient and does not require decoration. Callum's attorney objected occasionally. Carla Mendez addressed each objection with the same unhurried precision. The testimony continued. Callum sat at the defense table and did not look at Diane. He looked at his notepad, at the table surface, at various points in the middle distance that allowed him to appear composed without requiring him to meet the eyes of the woman on the stand. He had a system for this kind of endurance. He employed it now with everything he had. Across the room in the gallery, Walter Reeves sat in the second row with his hands resting on his knees and watched. Carla Mendez said, "In the fall of your second year in the relationship, you went to a doctor. Can you tell the court about that visit?" Diane's hands, which had been still in her lap since she sat down, pressed slightly together, not a flinch. A gathering, I went to a doctor at a clinic in the East Village, Diane said. Not the doctor the Hayes family used, not anyone connected to them. I paid cash. I told the doctor I had been in an accident. And had you been? No. What had happened? I had 4 broken ribs, Diane said. 2 on the left side, 2 on the right, a hairline fracture in my left wrist, and bruising that the doctor documented in photographs that I kept. A pause. She asked me, the doctor, if I was safe at home. I said yes. She gave me a card for a domestic violence resource center. I put it in my coat pocket, and I threw it away when I got home, because I was afraid of what would happen if he found it. The room was quiet in the specific way a room goes quiet when something true has landed in it. Why did you stay? Carla Mendez asked. Because he told me that if I left, he would destroy me, not physically, legally, financially. He had lawyers, he had people. He told me about a woman he had dated before me who had tried to make trouble and what had happened to her career, her reputation, her ability to get an apartment in the city. He was specific about it. The specificity was the point. Diane's voice did not waver. It had the quality of something that has been tested to its limits and has found, at those limits, not weakness but a different kind of strength, the kind that exists on the other side of having already survived the worst of it. I stayed for 8 more months, and then one night I packed a bag and I left while he was asleep, and I did not go back. And after you left? His family's lawyers contacted me within a week. They offered me a settlement in exchange for a non-disclosure agreement. I signed it because I had no money, no evidence that was legally usable at the time, and no confidence that anyone would believe me over a haze. She stopped. I also signed it because I was exhausted, and because I wanted it to be over. She looked at her hands. It was not over. I just stopped being able to talk about it. Carla Mendez let the room hold that for a moment. Then she said, "No further questions." Callum's attorney spent 12 minutes asking questions designed to introduce the possibility of motivated testimony. He was good at it. He had been doing it for 23 years. Diane answered each question the same way she had answered every question since she sat down. When the attorney finished and sat, and when the judge dismissed Diane from the stand, Callum allowed himself to look at her for the first time since she had walked in. She was gathering herself to stand, a small, composed motion. The motion of someone who has done what they came to do and is now simply returning to the rest of their life. She did not look at him. She had not looked at him once in 2 hours. He had been in the room the entire time, 8 feet away, and she had given him none of it. Not her eyes, not her acknowledgement, not even the satisfaction of her animosity. She had simply told the truth to the room and given him nothing. He watched her walk out through the side door. He was thinking about something Walter had said. She prepared this before I knew the footage existed. He had turned that sentence over many times since then. He was trying to find the moment when Nora had changed, the specific point in time when the woman he had believed he understood had become someone he apparently had not understood at all. He still could not find it. And the inability to find it meant something he was only now beginning to fully reckon with. That the change might not have been a change, that the person Nora actually was had been present the entire time, visible to anyone who was actually looking rather than only observing what they expected to see. The fluorescent light was very flat and very even, and it made no distinctions. The judge called a recess. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Callum stood at the window and looked out at Center Street below. It was a Tuesday in March, and the city was doing what the city does, regardless of what happens in its courtrooms. He heard his mother's heels on the marble floor before he saw her. Margaret came down the hallway with the posture she always had in situations she was managing. Upright, contained, moving with the efficiency of someone who has already decided what needs to happen. She stopped beside him at the window. Gerard says we need to discuss the possibility of a plea, she said. I know what Gerard says. The footage combined with Diane's testimony. I know, he said. She was quiet for a moment. We can still shape the outcome of this. The plea negotiations give us leverage to control the sentencing parameters. You knew about Diane, he said. Margaret was still looking out the window. From the beginning, he said, not just the NDA. You knew what had happened and you decided to manage it rather than. He stopped. He started again. You knew and you introduced me to Nora anyway, 3 years later. At that dinner. At the club where you said you thought they would get along. The hallway was quiet. Callum, Margaret said. Did you think it would be different? He said. Did you think that was a reasonable calculation? That you could just manage it? Absorb it? That money and paperwork and the right doctors were an indefinite solution? She turned to look at him. Her face had the expression he recognized from his entire childhood. The expression that preceded the explanation of why a difficult thing was actually the right thing. I thought, she said, slowly and carefully, that I understood the situation well enough to keep it contained. I was wrong about that. It was the most direct thing he had ever heard her say about any of it. He thought about what it means to be handed a blueprint you did not design and to follow it so completely that you forget it was ever a choice to follow it. He did not say any of this. He turned back to the window and looked at the street. Call Gerard, he said. Tell him I want to hear what the plea looks like. He came at 8:30 with coffee from the place on the corner. He knocked twice, and she let him in, and he set the cups on the table, and they sat down, and for a while they just existed in the room together in the way they had always been able to exist in silence without it becoming uncomfortable. June was in the bassinet, making small sounds that were not quite words yet, but had the rhythm and intention of words. Walter watched her for a while. She is going to be loud, he said. Like you were. I was not loud, Nora said. You were extremely loud, he said, from approximately age 2 until you discovered that quiet was more effective, which was around age 7. Your teachers were relieved. She looked at him. He was smiling, the contained kind he allowed himself in private. Dad, she said, there is something I want to ask you. He waited. When you came to his office, what was that like? Walter considered the question without rushing it. Quiet, he said. He is a man who is used to rooms moving around him. I sat in his chair and did not stand up when he came in, and the whole thing shifted right there in the first 30 seconds. You could see him recalculating. A pause. He is not stupid. That is important to understand. He is smart in specific, limited ways, and the limitation is that his intelligence mostly operates in service of himself, which means he has large blind spots in the areas where other people's interiors are concerned. He could not see you because he was not trying to. He only ever looked at you to confirm what he had already decided. And when you told him about Diane, Nora said, about her testifying, I told him the plea would be his best option, and I think some part of him had already started to know it, Walter said. The calculation on his face was, it was not fear exactly. It was the look of a man who has realized the room is much smaller than he thought. He paused. Then I told him you had named the baby June. Why did you tell him that? Because she has a name, Walter said simply. Because whatever she is to him legally or strategically going forward, she is a person with a name, and I thought he should know it while he was sitting in that room, understanding what he had done. Nora looked at her hands. Dad, she said, I am sorry I did not call you sooner. I am sorry I let it go as long as I did without. Stop, he said, not harshly, firmly, in the way he said things that needed to be the last word on a subject. You do not apologize to me for surviving something the way you could survive it. There is no version of this where you handled it wrong. There are versions where things might have moved faster. But fast is not the only measure of right. You got out. You got the baby out. You had a plan when most people would not have been able to plan anything. He looked at her. I am the one who should have been easier to call. She looked at him. This man who had been 3 deployments and 2 marriages and considerable distance away for most of her life, who had called from rotating phone numbers and asked how she was and believed her when she said fine, who had also padlocked a file cabinet and called a lawyer, and walked into a skyscraper and sat in a chair without being invited and said 3 words that changed everything. I should have called you, she said. I know why I did not. But I should have. Yeah, he said. You should have. He said it gently, without accusation, and I should have made it clearer that calling me was something you could do, that I would pick up, that I would know what to do with it. They sat with that for a moment. She is going to need to know you, Nora said. June. She is going to need her grandfather. I know, he said. That means being around, she said. Not just the calls from rotating numbers. Actually around. I know, he said again. I am working on what that looks like. I talked to a realtor up here last week. Brooklyn, maybe Jersey City, somewhere close. She looked at him. I am not asking permission, he said. I am telling you what I am doing, a pause. But I would be glad if it was okay with you. It is okay with me, she said. He nodded. He drank his coffee. She drank hers, though it had gone slightly cold. Outside, the neighborhood made its small, late noises. June made a sound that was not quite a word but had the distinct intention of a word. A small declarative syllable aimed at the ceiling, addressed to no one and to everything. She is definitely going to be loud, Walter said. Good, Nora said. The plea was entered on a Thursday morning in April, gray and cold, the kind of spring day New York offers when it wants to remind you that winter has not entirely conceded. Callum Hayes stood in the courtroom on Center Street and listened to his attorney enter a guilty plea on the charge of felony assault in the 1st degree. He did not look at the gallery. Nora was not in the gallery. She had not come, and she did not need to be there to know what the outcome was. 28 months. The judge accepted the plea and set the sentencing hearing and struck the gavel, and that was that. The specific, unremarkable administrative finality of a system processing one more case among the thousands it processed. The Hayes Industries Board voted 8-3 to remove Callum from his position as CEO 6 weeks earlier, while the proceedings were pending. The removal had been framed in the board minutes as a voluntary leave of absence, which was the language of people who need to preserve a version of events that allows for the possibility of later revision. The board would make a decision about rebranding that had already been discussed in 3 separate executive sessions and was, by all accounts, a decision the board had already made. Margaret resigned from the board of the Children's Hospital Foundation on the same day the plea was entered, and from the Arts Council the following morning, and from the advisory committee of the private school where she had served for 11 years. She did so without a statement, which was itself a statement, not of guilt, which she would never publicly acknowledge, but of calculation. Margaret Hayes understood, with the same clarity she had always brought to the management of difficult situations when a position had become untenable. Diane Rousseau settled a separate civil action against the Hayes estate 4 months later. The settlement was sufficient. She did not discuss the amount. What she did discuss, in a single interview with a reporter from a magazine that covered legal affairs and women's issues, was what she did with the money. A significant portion went toward a resource center in Queens for women navigating the specific and practically complicated process of leaving. The center opened in the fall. It did not have a name on the outside of the building. It did not need one. The people who needed to find it knew how to find it. Evelyn Marsh attended the housewarming for Nora's new apartment with a bottle of champagne and a very specific opinion about where the couch should go. She stayed for 3 hours and left only when June had fallen asleep on her chest and needed to be transferred to the crib, which Evelyn supervised with the authority of a woman who has held enough babies to know exactly how the transfer is done. She kissed Nora on the cheek at the door, held her by the shoulders for a moment, and said, "You were never alone. I just needed you to know it before I could be useful." Then she went back downstairs to her apartment and her orange cardigan and the specific unhurried life of a woman who has decided she has earned the right to live exactly as she pleases. Nora found a 2-bedroom apartment in a building 8 blocks from Evelyn's, on a street with a bodega on one corner and a small park on the other. The park had a sandbox and 2 benches and a single large tree that would be good for shade in summer. The apartment had windows that faced east and got good morning light and walls that were the particular off-white of a space that had not been decorated recently and could become whatever color she decided to make it. She stood in the empty living room on the day she got the keys and looked at the walls and thought about what color she would choose. Not bone. She was still figuring that out. But for the first time in a very long time, figuring it out felt like something she was allowed to do. A problem she was permitted to have. A version of the future she was entitled to want. Evelyn came to help with the move, which involved more direction than lifting, given her age and her strong opinions about furniture placement. Walter was there too, carrying boxes with the steady, unhurried efficiency of someone who has moved a lot of gear over a lot of distance and understands that the work goes best when you do not think about the total, only the current box. June observed all of it from the baby carrier on Nora's chest, her head turned sideways, watching boxes move past with the specific attentiveness that had come to seem like her signature. This child who looked at everything with complete focus as if the world were still new enough to deserve it, which it was. At the end of the day, after Evelyn had gone home and Walter had driven back to his hotel, Nora sat on the floor of the empty living room with her back against the wall and June asleep in her arms and looked at the space they were going to fill. She thought about the apartment on the Upper West Side. She thought about the bone-colored walls and the tile pattern and the bottom drawer of the dresser and the sound of the key in the lock. She thought about the white room she had built in her head, the one she had retreated to while her body stayed behind. She was not sure she would ever fully demolish that room. It had served her. It had been the thing she built to survive with, and you do not tear down something that saved you just because you no longer need saving. You keep it. You put it somewhere it can stay without occupying the center of things. She looked at the bare walls of the new apartment, at the morning light that would come through the east-facing windows in a few hours, when night finished and the city started again, the way the city always started again regardless. June's breathing was very even, in and out, the particular deep rhythm of a person who does not yet know that breathing requires attention, who breathes simply because breathing is what bodies do, without counting, without effort, without vigilance. Nora listened to her daughter breathe. She did not count anything. She thought about the name she had chosen. June, not a family name, not a tribute to anyone, not a meaning she had looked up, just a month she had always liked, the one that arrived at the end of a long winter and opened into summer, the one that had a particular quality of beginning in it. She had known the name before she knew the baby. She had kept it quietly in the back of her mind through everything, through the counting and the white room and the bottom drawer and the fear that she had made a mistake too large to survive. June. She had carried that small word through the worst of it like a flashlight in a coat pocket. Not always visible, not always needed, but there, outside, the city was doing what it did at that hour, moving, breathing, conducting its thousand small transactions in the dark. A siren somewhere in the distance. A car door, the bodega on the corner with its lights on, ready, always open. Nora sat on the floor of her apartment in the good dark and did not count anything at all.